India views the Lipulekh dispute primarily as a question of established administration, treaty interpretation, strategic connectivity, and long-standing India-China border trade and pilgrimage arrangements, while Nepal frames it as a sovereignty issue rooted in the Sugauli Treaty and contested hydrology of the Kali/Mahakali's origin. China has recently characterized the matter as a bilateral India-Nepal issue, even as Beijing and New Delhi agreed to reopen trade through the pass, underscoring Lipulekh's economic and geopolitical value for India-China logistics, Kailash, Mansarovar access, and border management along the Himalayan frontier. The recent resignation of Nepal's Prime Minister K.P. Sharma Oli amid violent youth-led protests and a social media shutdown complicates Kathmandu's ability to sustain a hardline diplomatic push, but the fundamental claims over Kalapani, Lipulekh, Limpiadhura remain unchanged. India rejects Nepal's objections as neither justified nor supported by historical evidence, while China signals it will not mediate, leaving Lipulekh's trade reopening likely to proceed under the India-China framework despite Nepal's protests. Geography and the treaty frame. Lipulekh is a high Himalayan pass at the India-Tibet-China frontier, abutting Nepal, linking India's Kumaon region with Tibet's Taklakot Purang, historically used by traders, pilgrims, and caravans. India regards the pass and adjacent Kalapani sector as part of Pithoragarh district, Uttarakhand, under continuous administrative control for decades. The dispute turns on the 1816 Sugauli Treaty clause that set the boundary along the Kali-Mahakali River. India identifies the river's origin near Kalapani, while Nepal claims Limpiadhura as the source, shifting the river line and placing Kalapani, Limpiadhura, Lipulekh east of the river and thus inside Nepal, two interpretations that generate overlapping maps and rival administrative claims. Nepal embedded its expanded claim in 2020 by publishing a new political map and incorporating it into its constitution. India disputes this cartography, citing administrative continuity and prior practice, while reiterating that boundary questions should be settled through diplomatic dialogue based on evidence rather than unilateral mapmaking. From New Delhi's standpoint, Lipulekh is part of India's sovereign territory, with a consistent position that border trade with China via Lipulekh began in 1954 and continued, with COVID-era disruptions, under multiple bilateral instruments, including a 1991 memorandum and later protocols that designated Lipulekh-Kyengla as a trade and pilgrimage corridor. India argues Nepal's objections are not grounded in historical facts. The area's significance is multidimensional: a critical land route to Kailash, Mansarovar for pilgrims, a logistics artery for border management along the line of actual control, and a time-tested channel for controlled cross-border commerce with Tibet, elements that India views as separate from the India-Nepal boundary disagreement. India has rejected Nepal's recent formal protests over the India-China decision to resume border trade, emphasizing continuity and precedent while expressing willingness to discuss boundary issues through established diplomatic mechanisms without halting India-China arrangements at Lipulekh. Kathmandu asserts that all territory east of the Mahakali belongs to Nepal under Sugauli, insisting that the true headwaters originate at Limpiadhura, thereby placing Lipulekh, Kalapani, and Limpiadhura within Nepal. Nepal has repeatedly protested India-China steps on Lipulekh, including road construction, trade designations, and pilgrimage facilitation. The codification of Nepal's claim through the 2020 constitutional map elevated the dispute into national identity politics, with periodic diplomatic notes to New Delhi and Beijing whenever agreements or announcements involve Lipulekh, including the August 2025 India-China trade reopening. Despite pushing Beijing for support, Nepal has faced China's recent stance that the issue is strictly bilateral between India and Nepal, narrowing Kathmandu's options to dialogue with New Delhi rather than seeking third-party leverage through Beijing. Beijing's official posture in early September 2025 is to respect Nepal's claim in principle but refrain from involvement, urging Kathmandu to resolve the matter directly with India. Simultaneously, China and India have agreed to resume border trade at Lipulekh, along with Shipki La and Nathu La, reflecting compartmentalization from broader boundary tensions. The 1991 Memorandum and subsequent protocols in 1992, 2005, 2014, and 2015 established Lipulekh's role for trade and regulated movement, including pilgrims, protocols that Beijing treats as valid with India irrespective of Nepal's protests, signaling prioritization of functional trade corridors on the. For China, reopening Lipulekh supports local Tibetan economy via Taklakot, normalizes contact with India after years of stasis, and is manageable within existing border trade frameworks. Distancing from the bilateral dispute helps avoid complicating India ties and avoids setting precedents for Chinese entanglement in third-party boundary claims. Resumption of India-China trade via Lipulekh. India and China jointly announced on 20 August 2025 the resumption of border trade through Lipulekh Pass, as well as Shipki La and Nathu La, emphasizing that Lipulekh has historically connected India's Kumaon region to Tibet for commodities, transport, and pilgrimage movements. The reopening marks a thaw in India-China functional ties since the COVID suspension and post-2020 friction, restoring controlled bilateral land commerce channels that are geographically shorter for specific Himalayan border communities and niche trade items compared to maritime routes. India's official response to Nepal's objection stressed continuity since 1954 and absence of historical basis for Kathmandu's claims, indicating New Delhi will not subordinate India-China trade decisions at designated passes to Nepal's unilateral map assertions. Why Lipulekh matters for trade. Lipulekh shortens transit between India's Kumaon belt and Tibet's Taklakot market, enabling seasonal, regulated exchange in staples, woolens, medicinal herbs, and local manufactured goods that sustain high-altitude economies. It is thus a lifeline for frontier communities and a symbolic connector for bilateral normalization. The pass also underpins organized Kailash, Mansarovar pilgrimage flows, which generate ancillary economic activity on both sides and require predictable passage, medical support, and logistics, functions that benefit from a reopened corridor and reinforce people-to-people and commercial ties despite broader geopolitical headwinds. In strategic terms, controlled trade corridors like Lipulekh help institutionalize border management, reduce incentives for informal crossings, and provide monitored channels for goods, making the frontier more predictable and administratively legible to both states. Nepal's formal position, reiterated in August 2025, is that Limpiyadhura, Lipulekh, Kalapani are integral parts of Nepal east of the Mahakali. It has urged India to halt road expansion or trade in the area and has also notified China that any bilateral reopening at Lipulekh disregards Nepal's sovereignty. In Beijing, Oli raised the issue with Xi Jinping, but China framed it as bilateral and non-justiciable through Chinese mediation. This leaves any successor government to prioritize dialogue with New Delhi if it seeks concrete movement beyond symbolic protests. With domestic instability, immediate Nepalese strategy likely centers on sustaining diplomatic notes and public messaging while avoiding steps that invite economic fallout. The structural constraint remains China's refusal to intercede and India's reliance on past practice at Lipulekh. What China says and why. China has told Nepal it respects the claim but will not be party to the dispute, encouraging bilateral talks. This is consistent with Beijing's preference to compartmentalize functional border trade from third-party territorial disagreements, especially when such disagreements implicate India-Nepal Treaty interpretation. Reopening Lipulekh fits China's interest in revitalizing border microeconomies and pilgrim routes, while projecting stability in Tibet's border markets. It also gestures toward limited normalization with India without needing breakthroughs on the Sino-Indian boundary question. By treating Lipulekh as a bilateral India-Nepal issue, Beijing reduces diplomatic risk and preserves maneuvering space with both neighbors, avoiding precedents that could entangle it in other South Asian boundary controversies. For India, Lipulekh secures a practical, shorter overland link to Tibet that undergirds religious tourism, frontier livelihoods, and calibrated commerce, all under an established framework that predates Nepal's 2020 map and continues despite recent turbulence. This continuity helps stabilize border communities and showcases administrative control in the Kalapani sector. The corridor also supports logistics and contingency mobility along the central sector of the Lak, making it strategically relevant beyond commerce. Reliable access routes at altitude reduce response times and enhance situational management, even if normal trade is seasonal and regulated. India's legal technical stance, that the Mahakali's origin lies near Kalapani, underwrites its claim. Combined with decades of administration and bilateral India-China instruments, it sees no basis to suspend Lipulekh functions due to unilateral cartography from Kathmandu. Future scenarios for Lipulekh. Trade proceeds, protest continues. India-China trade via Lipulekh resumes under existing protocols while Nepal maintains diplomatic protests and domestic consensus around its 2020 map. China remains hands-off, pressing for bilateral India-Nepal talks that make slow, technical progress without altering trade flows. Negotiated de-escalation. Political transition in Kathmandu yields calibrated engagement with New Delhi field surveys, joint technical committees on hydrology, and confidence building, reducing rhetoric and allowing Nepal to separate sovereignty talks from India-China operational trade at the pass. Episodic friction. Any fresh infrastructure announcement or pilgrimage surge can trigger new protests or parliamentary motions in Nepal. However, absent Chinese support, escalation is likely rhetorical and diplomatic rather than operationally disruptive to India-China arrangements. Practical implications of India-China trade from Lipulekh. Frontier economies. Reopening offers seasonal stimulus to border communities on both sides, with regulated lists of tradable goods and customs oversight. This cushions livelihoods in high-altitude zones where alternatives are limited and logistics costs are high. Pilgrimage and soft power. Kailash, Mansarovar yatras rely on predictable corridors, medical stations, and staging camps. Lipulekh's functionality enhances the pilgrimage ecosystem and associated services in Uttarakhand, reinforcing India's cultural diplomacy footprint. Strategic signaling. Reinstating trade at Lipulekh, alongside Shipki-La and Nathu-La, signals the two major powers can compartmentalize and execute limited confidence building on the frontier, even as broader boundary talks continue, useful for crisis management optics and practical deconfliction. What changes after Oli's resignation? Near-term, Kathmandu's crisis diverts energy from sustained external activism, though any coalition will preserve the constitutional map. Bureaucratic routines, protest notes, public statements will continue, but operational leverage remains minimal without China's involvement. India is likely to engage any successor with an emphasis on technical dialogue, while decoupling it from India-China corridor decisions. This offers a path for confidence building without conceding on the core territorial interpretation. The principal constants, India's administrative control, China's trade compartmentalization, Nepal's map claim, remain. Thus, Lipulekh trade is poised to proceed, while boundary talks with Nepal track on a slower, evidence-based channel centered on hydrology and historical practice. Bottom line on Lipulekh's importance. Lipulekh is strategically and economically significant as a controlled mountain gateway that supports India-China border trade, Kailash, Mansarovar access, and logistical resilience on the Himalayan frontier. Its reopening reflects functional normalization despite broader tensions. Nepal's claim, grounded in an alternative reading of the Mahakali's headwaters and constitutional cartography ensures continuing diplomatic friction, but China's choice to stand aside constrains Kathmandu's leverage. India's rejection of Nepal's objections indicates trade will proceed under established India-China instruments. Given these vectors, what comes out of Lipulekh in the near term is a resumption of regulated trade and pilgrim transit between India and China, parallel to slow-moving India-Nepal boundary talks, two tracks likely to coexist without resolution in the immediate future.